Jack Hayes. 76 was once the pride of the United States Marine Corps. 3 combat tours, countless lives saved, and more scars than medals. But years later, in Fairhaven, Ohio, no one remembered his name. He was just another homeless man hunched under storefront awnings, quietly collecting cans, surviving off the kindness of strangers. One bitter winter afternoon, he was arrested for stealing a bruised apple and a stale bread roll from a local grocery store, a petty theft to most. But for Jack, it was the final blow from a system that had long since abandoned him. His veterans' benefits had been cut off not for misconduct, but because he no longer had a mailing address. No address. No help. No one questioned it. No one intervened. Until his worn military dog tag slipped from his coat and clinked onto the judge's bench. The sound was faint, but to the man presiding over the courtroom, it was thunder, because the name engraved on that piece of metal belonged to the very Marine who had once saved his life on a battlefield decades earlier. The courtroom froze. A town was shaken awake, and a nation was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. How many heroes have we forgotten simply because they no longer have a place to call home? Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below, because some stories don't just need to be told. They need to be remembered. The snow hit like shards of glass that morning, slicing sideways through the cracked windows of Paxton's grocery, where the open sign flickered with the same exhaustion as the man standing beneath it. Jack Hayes, 67, former U.S. Marine, now barely a shadow of that title, hunched his shoulders against the cold as he stepped inside. The air stank of bleach and old produce. But for Jack, it was the closest thing to warmth he had known in days. He moved slow, careful, the limp in his right leg worse today from the cold seeping through his worn-out boots. His coat, once Marine Corps blue, now sun-bleached to gray, hung loose on his gaunt frame. His fingers, cracked and trembling, brushed over a crate of discounted apples, bruised, half-rotting, 50% off. His stomach twisted painfully. Hunger had become more familiar than his own reflection. No one was watching. Mr. Paxton, the store's owner, was busy at the register, arguing gently with an elderly woman over coupon values. The teenage stock boy was at the far end, lost in his earbuds, stacking cans as if the world outside didn't exist. Jack's hand hovered over the apples. The moral weight was suffocating, but reality had no patience for pride. He slipped an apple into his inner coat pocket. His pulse thundered. A stale bread roll followed, disappearing into the opposite pocket. That was when the voice hit him. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" Jack's breath caught. Mr. Paxton's face was purple with indignation as he charged across the dingy linoleum, each step heavier than the last. Jack straightened instinctively, military reflexes overriding his exhaustion. But his words failed him. I was just, he began. But it didn't matter. Paxton had already grabbed the phone, stabbing numbers with righteous fury. "Police, now! We don't tolerate thieves here." Jack didn't resist. Didn't run. He simply stood there, a relic from a war most had chosen to forget, clutching a bruised apple like it was a war crime. His silence was more damning than any confession, minutes later. The bell above the door jangled sharply as 2 officers entered. Officer Derek Collins was all bulk and bluntness, his buzz cut making him look as though he'd been carved from concrete. Beside him, Officer Maria Lopez moved with quieter authority, her sharp brown eyes sweeping the scene. "Hands where I can see them," Collins barked, already reaching for the cuffs. Jack obeyed. The movement mechanical, as if he had rehearsed this indignity before. But Lopez noticed something, a glint of metal beneath Jack's frayed collar. She stepped closer, squinting as she read the faded inscription. Hayes, Jack T., USMC, blood type O+. The dog tag swung gently, catching the cold light. Lopez paused, just for a breath. Collins didn't. He spun Jack around, cuffing his wrists with the same efficiency he'd use bagging groceries. Shoplifting is shoplifting. Buddy. Still. Lopez's fingers lingered near the dog tag. For her. This wasn't protocol anymore. This was a name. A history. She slid the tag free, turning it over in her gloved hand, feeling its weight far beyond the ounces it claimed. Did you serve? Mr. Hayes, she asked, voice low. Personal. Jack's reply was simple, a nod. A long time ago. Back when it mattered. Collins snorted. Save it for the judge. With a push. Jack was guided toward the cruiser parked outside, its lights flashing against the curtain of falling snow. Lopez followed, the tag burning cold in her palm. It said more about Jack than any police report ever would. The ride to the station was silent. Fairhaven blurred past, storefronts boarded up, windows frosted over. Jack stared out, his breath fogging the glass, while Collins filled out forms and Lopez sat unusually quiet, because now she was thinking. Who had they really arrested today? A petty thief grabbing scraps, or a man the country had once pinned medals on? Only to forget. But for now, duty marched forward. The patrol car slid to a stop at Fairhaven Municipal Holding. The paperwork awaited. The booking process. The cold cell. For Jack Hayes. Another layer of dignity was about to be stripped away as they opened the door. Lopez hesitated. She slipped the dog tag into her pocket, her fingers curling around it as if holding a truth no one else had bothered to see. But the wheels of the system had been set in motion. Her moment of recognition could not stop it. Not yet. Tomorrow, in courtroom 4C, that tag would fall again louder this time. And when it did, even the people who had chosen not to see Jack Hayes would have no choice but to listen. That, however, would be tomorrow's battle. For tonight. The cold steel bars were waiting. The holding cell stank of old sweat, bleach, and a faint undercurrent of rust. The single overhead bulb flickered sporadically, casting Jack Hayes' shadow in fractured, jerking movements against the cinderblock walls. The cold seeped up from the concrete floor, through the thin metal cot, and into his bones. He'd known colder places Afghanistan's desert nights, the biting winds of Korean winters, but this chill felt different. It wasn't the kind that froze your skin. It was the kind that hollowed you out from the inside. He sat, hunched, elbows on his knees, hands clasped around a small, weathered photograph. The edges were frayed, the gloss worn down to a matte blur from years of handling. But the smile was still there. Emily, his wife, his anchor. In that moment. The cell walls faded. The flickering bulb gave way to the softer light of a hospital room, sterile and cold in its own way. He could see her again, propped up against thin pillows, trying to be brave for him. The color had drained from her face by then, her voice a brittle whisper. They had called it a misdiagnosis. The VA had shuffled her through a maze of appointments, lost lab results, and indifferent specialists until it was too late to fix what had been ignored. Jack had sat by her side, helpless in a way no battlefield had ever made him feel. He had carried wounded men through gunfire, shielded civilians from mortar blasts, survived ambushes in cities without names. But none of that mattered when the enemy was paperwork, when bureaucracy bled a person out slower than any bullet. I'm so tired. Jack, she had said one night, her fingers curling weakly around his. "But promise me, you won't let bitterness be the last thing that remembers me." He had promised, and he had kept that promise in the only way he knew how, when Emily passed. Jack sold their modest brick home on Willow Lane. Every dollar of it, every last cent he donated to the local animal shelter Emily had loved. She'd spent weekends there, tending to abandoned dogs, believing in quiet kindnesses the world seemed to forget. The shelter's director had cried when Jack handed over the check. Jack hadn't stayed for the thank you. He couldn't. The house, once filled with her laughter, had become a mausoleum. Staying would have been suffocation. So, he left. Not with fanfare, not with a dramatic farewell. He simply folded into the fabric of the forgotten. Some men disappear in combat. Jack disappeared in plain sight. He refused handouts, wouldn't beg. Pride didn't leave a man easily. He survived on scrap metal, collected cans, odd jobs when they came. Places like Marcy's Diner had kept him going longer than he'd admit, slipping him coffee and sandwiches with the silent understanding of those who still recognized his name, if not his face. But dignity, Jack had learned, doesn't fill an empty stomach now, in this cage of gray and iron. Hunger gnawed at him more viciously than ever. His hands shook not from fear, but from a body pushed beyond its limit. He pressed the photograph to his chest, feeling the brittle paper against the threadbare fabric of his shirt. "I kept my promise." "Em," he whispered, "I gave them everything we had." But it turns out, the country I fought for doesn't promise much in return. The words didn't echo. The cell absorbed them. As if used to such confessions, Jack closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, remembering what it felt like to be needed, to be seen. Once, he had stood tall in his marine blues, receiving salutes, thanks, recognition. Now, he was a statistic, a case file with charges of petty theft and loitering scribbled over the faded records of valor, he wondered. Not bitterly, but with a sort of detached curiosity. When exactly he had crossed that invisible line from hero to burden? Was it the day Emily died? Or the day the VA labeled his case closed because no address meant no benefits? It didn't really matter. The result was the same. The rattle of keys jolted him back. The guard didn't say anything as he passed, likely just checking cells before his shift ended. Jack didn't mind. Silence was better than platitudes. His stomach cramped sharply. The bread roll he had tried to steal earlier would have made little difference. But now, the ache was a living thing, clawing at his insides. Dignity, it seemed, was a luxury he could no longer afford. He sat back, letting the cold seep deeper, numbing more than just his skin. Somewhere beyond these walls, Fairhaven slept on, indifferent. Life moved on. Bills paid, doors locked, families gathered. He was just another shadow, easily ignored, but even shadows can stretch unexpectedly. Jack's fingers traced the outline of Emily's smile one more time, anchoring himself against the hollow space she had left. The world may have forgotten Jack Hayes, but tonight, in this small, forgotten corner of Fairhaven, he still remembered who he was, outside. The wind howled like a distant war cry, and hunger was no longer just an ache. It was the thing that would force his hand, tomorrow. He would reach a threshold, one that even the proudest Marine could no longer stand behind. The next morning, the courtroom would have its turn. The world would look at Jack Hayes again. But would they really see him this time? Courtroom 4C wasn't grand. It wasn't meant to be. Beige walls, flickering fluorescent lights, a cracked tile beneath the judge's bench that no one bothered to fix. This was where Fair Haven processed its petty crimes with cold efficiency. Miss Demet, the defendant's table. Jack Hayes stood like a man out of place. His frame was hunched, his coat sagging off his shoulders. The marine blues so faded they looked gray. Beside his scuffed boots sat an old Dino family had shown up. No friends, only empty benches and a clerk going through the motions. Case number 19842, the clerk announced, voice flat, eyes never lifting from her docket. Petty theft. Shoplifting. 1 apple. 1 bread are 2 items. So simple. So insignificant. Yet at the prosecutor's table. Ethan Cole adjusted his tie, rising with the briskness of a man who believed every word he was about to say mattered. Young. Sharp suit. Fresh from law school. Ethan treated this like a rehearsal for bigger trials. Jack wasn't a person to him, just another case to knock off before lunch. Your Honor, Ethan began. His tone clipped. Rehearsed. The defendant was apprehended at Paxton's grocery, removing merchandise without payment. Surveillance footage confirms the theft of 1 apple and 1 bread roll. The defendant has no fixed address, no current employment, prior citations for loitering and public intoxication, based on these factors. The people request he delivered it clean, professional, detached, for Ethan. This was easy, a textbook misdemeanor, no complications, no drama at the bench. Judge William Parker sat elevated above the room, fingers drumming the worn oak, his glasses perched low on his nose as he flipped through the file. Another name. Another story that didn't matter. The system kept moving. His job was to keep pace. But as he turned a page, something unexpected slid out. A small, metallic object. It clattered against the bench, the sound sharp, intrusive, a dog tag. The courtroom fell silent as it skidded to a stop. Parker's hand froze, slowly, deliberately. He reached out, picked it up. His thumb traced the engraved letters, Hayes, Jack T. USMC, for a moment. Parker wasn't a judge. He was a soldier. The memories hit with a force no courtroom had ever prepared him for. Fallujah, 2004. The ambush, the burning Humvee, and this Marine dragging him out of hell. That Marine was now standing at the defendant's table, charged over a bruised apple and a stale roll. Ethan Cole shifted. Noticing the change, his script no longer fit. Your Honor. As stated, he started. But the momentum was gone. Parker cut him off, voice steady but different, requesting a 5-minute recess. The words dropped like a stone in water. Unusual, unprecedented. For petty theft, the clerk hesitated. Your Honor. The gavel struck once, sharp, final. Recess granted. Ethan frowned, but stayed silent. He'd read enough courtroom dynamics to know when something had shifted beyond his control. Jack stood still. He hadn't moved since his name was called. His face betrayed nothing. But inside, he felt the weight of that small, accidental sound, the clatter of metal that had stopped an entire machine. Judge Parker gathered the dog tag, his fingers curling around it as he stood. His robe swayed slightly as he left the bench. Disappearing into his chambers without another word, the room buzzed, murmurs rising. Why a recess? Why now? For what? For who? Jack lowered himself back into his seat, knees creaking. He had no illusions. This wasn't salvation. He knew better. But something had cracked. A fracture in the smooth, indifferent process that had been grinding him down for years. A few curious glances now lingered. People who had barely registered him minutes ago were suddenly remembering his name. Not because he had spoken, but because the past had. Ethan Cole sat stiffly, flipping his file closed. This was no longer routine. The simple case he'd prepared for had just grown layers he hadn't anticipated at the defense table. Jack's fingers brushed his duffel bag. Same bag, same man. But today, that dog tag had reminded the world of something it preferred to forget. Seated high above them moments ago, Judge Parker had read a list of infractions, but the dog tag had told a different story, one that refused to stay buried behind closed doors. Parker now held that story in his hand, and Fairhaven was about to reckon with it, because Jack Hayes wasn't just a petty thief. He was a name they used to salute, and names like that don't disappear quietly. Judge William Parker sat heavily in his chambers, the door clicking shut behind him, sealing out the whispers that had erupted in courtroom 4C in his hand. The dog tag felt heavier than it had any right to be. He turned it slowly, thumb brushing over letters he knew by heart. Now, Hayes, Jack T. USMC. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in years, but his mind filled in the gaps effortlessly. The sand, the heat, the ambush that ripped through their convoy like a blade through cloth. The smell of burning diesel still clung to the edges of his memory, and Jack Hayes had been there, not in the periphery, not as a statistic, but as the man who had grabbed Parker by his flak vest, hauling him bodily out of a twisted Humvee, ignoring his own bleeding leg. As gunfire cracked overhead, Jack had been the reason Parker walked out of Fallujah alive. Now, that same man had stood silently before his bench, charged with stealing a bruised apple and a stale bread roll. Parker exhaled. A slow, controlled breath. His fingers curled around the tag tighter. He had seen hundreds of cases in this room. Drug offenses, assaults, the slow, grinding march of lives derailed. He had built a fortress of detachment around himself, a defense against the weight of other people's tragedies. But this wasn't another sad file. This was personal. How had they let Jack fall this far? He flipped open the court file again, more carefully this time. The paperwork was thin, deliberately thin. Prior citations for loitering, public intoxication, no address, no job. But no one had bothered to connect the dots beyond that. The VA records were missing. Or perhaps, conveniently buried. A man with combat commendations, reduced to a petty theft case over a piece of fruit and a piece of bread. Parker's jaw tensed, out there in the courtroom. Young Ethan Cole was probably pacing, wondering why his easy conviction had suddenly derailed. The clerk would be checking her watch. But none of that mattered now. This wasn't going to be another rubber-stamped sentence, setting the tag carefully on his desk. Parker reached for the phone. "Get me military records on a Jack Thomas Hayes," he said, keeping his tone measured. "Marine Corps, served in Iraq, early 2000s, and pull up anything from Veterans Affairs tied to his name. I want that file on my desk immediately." The line clicked as the request went through. He sat back, staring at the tag again. "All these years," he muttered. "You saved my life. And now you stand accused of stealing your next meal?" The courtroom outside awaited his return, the noise having dulled to a low hum. The gravity of the pause was beginning to settle on everyone. It wasn't normal. Courtrooms hate surprises. This was a system built on predictable motions. But today, the predictable had cracked. Parker stood, gathering the dog tag. He straightened his robe, shoulders squaring, posture taller than when he had entered. This wasn't about pity. This was about duty, about paying back a debt long overdue when he re-entered courtroom 4C. The air was sharp with anticipation. Conversations died instantly. Even Ethan Cole, who had been ready to press forward, took a step back at the look on Parker's face. "Mr. Hayes," Parker began, voice calm, but carrying weight now. Before this court proceeds, I am ordering an immediate review of your military service records and VA status. He let that settle. It wasn't a request, it was a declaration. The current proceedings are stayed until further notice. Ethan opened his mouth to object, but Parker didn't even glance at him. He continued without pause. Furthermore, I am requesting assistance from the Veterans Legal Defense Network. Mr. Hayes will have full representation effective immediately. The room reacted in ripples, first confusion, then a slow, collective realization that something significant had just occurred. This wasn't how shoplifting cases went. Not for apples, not for bread. Parker's eyes, sharp and unwavering, locked on Jack. You are not invisible here. Staff Sergeant. The title landed with precision, cutting through the courtroom's detached ritual for a moment. Jack's shoulders seemed to straighten, as if the name itself had reached beneath the weight pressing him down at the prosecutor's table. Ethan had the decency to look uncomfortable now, his earlier confidence deflated in the face of a reality no textbook had prepared him for. Parker tapped the dog tag once against the bench, a small, deliberate gesture. Then he set it down. No further motions, no dramatic speeches, just a subtle but undeniable shift in how this courtroom would now regard the man they had labeled petty thief. Outside, snow drifted silently against the courthouse windows, but inside, the weight of a long-ignored debt had finally begun to tip. This was no longer a simple theft case, and Jack Hayes was no longer just another name on a docket, because today, the court had remembered what that name had once meant, and Parker was not about to let them forget again. The office of Judge William Parker was not built for reflection. It was functional, a desk scarred by years of elbows and gavels, a wall of overstuffed shelves groaning under the weight of legal codes, and a single, stubborn window that let in the dull gray of a Fairhaven winter. Today, though, the cold outside felt less biting than the file Parker now held in his hands. Jack Hayes. Parker had ordered a full pull of his military records, not trusting the thin packet the court had been provided. What came back was a disgrace not of Jack's making, but of a system that had quietly, methodically erased him. He spread the documents out across his desk. Here, buried beneath bureaucratic indifference, lay a different man than the petty thief charged in his courtroom. Bronze Star for Valor, 2004, for shielding wounded comrades during a mortar attack outside Ramadi. 2 Purple Hearts. Both earned pulling civilians from ambush sites under direct fire. A combat action ribbon. There were letters. 2 testimonies from fellow Marines, from Iraqi civilians. Accounts of a man who stayed behind to teach kids how to read in the dust-choked evenings between patrols. Of a man who shared his rations with local families when supplies ran thin. None of this had surfaced during the morning's proceedings, because no one had cared to look. Parker's eyes narrowed as he reached the part that stung worst. VA benefits terminated. 2007. Reason no known address. No known address. He read it twice, the clinical language twisting into something uglier with each pass. It wasn't a lost form. It wasn't a technical oversight. It was a verdict, an erasure. Because Jack Hayes had no fixed address. The system had closed his case. Closed. As if a man could be filed away because he no longer had an apartment to receive letters. No benefits. No support. No safety net. Jack hadn't fallen through the cracks. He had been pushed. Parker leaned back, the dog tag still resting at the corner of his desk. A dull gleam beneath the office's cheap lighting. His fingers steepled, pressing hard against his lips. He had sat on this bench for nearly 3 decades. He had witnessed men like Jack pass through his courtroom, watched their stories reduced to charges and case numbers, and he had let the machine keep turning. But this was personal. This system doesn't let people fall, he muttered, almost to himself. It pushes them out, quietly, efficiently, and no one notices until they steal an apple. The words tasted bitter. He glanced at the photo frame on his shelf. A much younger Parker, fresh from law school, shaking hands with decorated veterans at a Memorial Day ceremony. Back then, service had meant something. Back then, names like Jack Hayes weren't statistics, but somewhere along the way, the lines blurred, the forms piled up. Cases came faster, and it became easier to see files than faces. He closed the folder slowly, the weight of it settling on his desk like a judgment. This was not just about Jack Hayes anymore. It was about every quiet dismissal, every unchecked box, every man and woman who had been folded into bureaucratic nothingness because it was convenient. Parker stood, for the first time in years. He felt the familiar tension of purpose draw his spine straighter. Not the rote duty of courtroom procedure, not the safe distance of impartiality, but the raw, uncomfortable pull of responsibility. He reached for his phone. "Get me the regional VA office director," he said. Tone sharp. Not a secretary. The director. "I want a review of Jack Hayes' case opened immediately, and find me someone from Veterans Legal Defense, someone who doesn't mind stepping on toes." The assistant on the other end barely had time to respond before Parker continued. "And contact local media. Discreetly. They should be aware that Fairhaven's court is reviewing a mishandled veterans benefits case." He hung up. The dog tag still lay on the desk. He picked it up, the metal cool against his skin, and slipped it into his pocket. This wasn't symbolism. It was a reminder, a weight he chose to carry. Parker knew what came next wouldn't be simple. The machine resists when you try to slow it down, but there were debts that demanded payment. Outside, the courthouse clock chimed, each strike echoing like a challenge. In courtroom 4C, the wheels of routine were idling, waiting for his return. But this time, Parker wasn't bringing back just another ruling. He was bringing a reckoning for years. He had let silence pass as neutrality today. That ended, and Fairhaven would remember what it owed by the time Jack Hayes returned to courtroom 4C the next morning. Fairhaven was no longer the sleepy town content to look the other way. Something had shifted, not because of motions filed or judge's orders, but because of a phone, a shaky live stream, and a young reporter who refused to stay quiet. Megan Blake was 25, 2 years out of journalism school, and tired of writing about bake sales and council meetings. When she'd been assigned to cover a petty theft case involving a homeless veteran, she'd almost dismissed it as another filler piece. Then she had seen the dog tag hit the judge's bench, and everything changed that night, while the town slept. Megan had posted a simple clip to her personal account. No edits, no filters, just raw footage of a courtroom pausing mid-sentence because the man they were ready to convict had once carried half that room through a war zone. Her caption was blunt. Jack Hayes fought for this country. Yesterday, he stood trial for stealing an apple and a bread roll. We talk about supporting our veterans. Today, Fairhaven showed what that really means. The video caught fire. By morning, it wasn't just local followers clicking share. Veteran groups across the country reposted it. Former Marines tagged fellow service members. Hashtags like #Honor Jack Hayes and Forgotten Veterans surged to the top of trending lists. National outlets picked up the story within hours. Jack, unaware of the digital storm swirling around his name, sat quietly at the defense table, his posture unchanged. But outside, Beyond the courthouse doors, the narrative had escaped the control of court transcripts and official records. Today, it belonged to the people. Megan stood near the courthouse entrance, phone in hand. Live once more. We're back at Fairhaven Municipal Court, where Staff Sergeant Jack Hayes, yes, the same man you've seen all over your feeds, is awaiting the next steps in his case. She panned her camera slowly, capturing the line of veterans now forming outside. Some wore faded service caps. Others held folded flags close to their chests. They hadn't come because of subpoenas. They had come because they knew what it felt like to be forgotten. Remember, this started with a stolen apple and a bread roll, Megan continued, her voice steady. But the real theft was years ago, when this system decided a missing home address was enough to erase a man's service. Inside, Judge Parker felt the weight of those eyes. Cameras might not have been allowed in his courtroom, but public attention seeped through walls. He welcomed it. This time, the spotlight was overdue. At the prosecutor's table, Ethan Cole was noticeably less confident. His tidy stack of papers now seemed woefully inadequate in the face of public scrutiny. His open and shut case had become a symbol of institutional failure overnight. Megan's live stream didn't falter. Comments poured in, scrolling faster than she could read. My dad served with guys like Jack. This is a disgrace. Where do I donate to his defense? VA messed this up. Again, he saved lives, and this is how we repay him. The echo chamber grew louder. Megan's phone buzzed with notification after notification. But she didn't flinch. This was no longer just reporting. This was witnessing inside the courtroom. Parker began proceedings with the same formal tone. But beneath it, there was a current of resolve, given new information regarding Mr. Hayes' military service and VA records. This court acknowledges significant procedural oversights in prior evaluations of his circumstances. He glanced toward Jack, then out over the courtroom. He knew eyes were watching from far beyond these four walls. This is not merely a question of theft, Parker continued. It is a question of recognition, of how we, as a community and as a nation, choose to treat those who have borne the burden of service. Outside, Megan's livestream audience erupted in digital applause. The court had acknowledged what the people already knew. The hearing proceeded. But the energy in the room was different now. Every word was measured, every glance more careful. Jack's story had slipped beyond paper. It was alive now, carried by every person scrolling through their phones, every veteran seeing their own reflection in his struggle. As Megan lowered her phone, ending the live feed, she whispered to herself, from one fallen apple, a whole country's conscience gets shaken. It wasn't just a soundbite. It was the truth. Jack Hayes had been invisible until the system tripped over his name, until a dog tag spoke louder than a prosecutor's report. And now, that ripple had become a wave. Fairhaven couldn't contain this anymore. The nation was watching. And with every share, every comment, every veteran standing outside that courthouse, the weight of that forgotten promise grew heavier. For Jack, for every name like his, the courtroom might still wear its robes and gavels. But today, the real judgment was being passed elsewhere, in the hands of the people. Courtroom 4C had never seen a crowd like this. By the time Jack Hayes was escorted to the defense table, the gallery was standing room only. But these weren't the usual curious locals or restless reporters. This was different. The uniforms had long since been folded away. But the bearing remained. Veterans, shoulder to shoulder, filled every seat, their presence louder than any outburst. Old Marine Corps ball caps sat next to Army insignias. Navy pins glinted under the cheap fluorescent lights. Some came in pressed dress blues, others in weathered jackets, patches threadbare from years of wear. They stood when Jack entered, not in defiance, not in pity, but in respect. A silent formation, as precise as any they'd ever held in service. Jack paused at the defendant's table. Taking it in? He didn't smile. He barely nodded, but something in his shoulders lifted, as if the weight pressing him down had been shouldered by many at the bench. Judge Parker acknowledged the shift. The court clerk's usual drone felt strangely out of place now. Mr. Hayes's defense will be represented today by Anna Monroe of the Veterans Legal Defense Network. The murmurs returned, not from doubt, but recognition. The VLDF had a reputation ferocious, relentless, and unapologetic when it came to defending those the system overlooked. Anna Monroe stood, professional yet unflinching. Mid-30s, sharp suit, sharper eyes. She approached Jack's table, setting her leather briefcase down with the precision of someone who didn't waste movements. Staff Sergeant Hayes. She addressed him, deliberately using his rank. Her voice was calm, clipped, yet carried an undertone of steel. I'm here to represent you, pro bono. You're not paying a dime. Jack's instinct was to protest. Pride. Even now. Stirred reflexively. Anna saw it coming. You earned this, Sergeant. Don't mistake justice for charity. Her words didn't need volume. They cut clean. Then, turning to face the courtroom, Anna spoke with deliberate clarity. Mr. Hayes is not alone in this room. Not today, not ever. Once, he stood for others. Today, we stand for him. Her statement wasn't for show. It was a formation, a line in the sand, a low murmur of agreement rippled through the veterans seated behind. No slogans, no chants, just the quiet affirmation of men and women who knew what it meant to watch out for their own Ethan Cole. The young prosecutor sat stiffly. His case file now looked embarrassingly thin. What had begun as a routine shoplifting charge had grown teeth, and Anna Monroe had just made it clear this was no longer a small-town misdemeanor. Judge Parker leaned forward slightly, steepling his fingers. Miss Monroe, you are prepared to proceed, I am. Your Honor. Anna opened her briefcase, removing a folder thicker than the one Ethan had presented. It was filled with records, testimonials, VA correspondence, and most damning of all, the paper trail of bureaucratic neglect that had led Jack Hayes here. But Anna wasn't rushing. She wanted the court to feel every second of what had been overlooked. I intend to demonstrate, she said, voice level, that Mr. Hayes' current circumstances are the direct result of systemic failures in veteran support services. This is not a case of willful theft. This is the inevitable outcome when a nation forgets its own promises. Ethan cleared his throat, but the weight of the room pressed him into his chair. Anna continued. This isn't about an apple or a bread roll. It's about a man who was asked to sacrifice, who did so willingly, and who was then discarded when he no longer fit the system's convenience. The words landed hard. Judge Parker gave a slight nod, a signal of both acknowledgement and permission. Proceed. Ms. Monroe, in the gallery. No one moved. Even the usual shuffling of papers, the clearing of throats, seemed to hold its breath. Anna had taken command of the room not with volume, not with theatrics, but with the simple, undeniable weight of truth at the defense table. Jack sat straighter. For the first time. He wasn't facing the court alone. The formation was reformed. Different battlefield. Same principle. Ethan knew his moment to counter was coming. But the narrative had shifted beneath his feet. The story was no longer his to frame. Anna's next move would not be procedural, it would be personal, because once you remind a community what service looks like, ignoring it becomes impossible. And, once again, as it had been in deserts half a world away. Jack Hayes wasn't standing alone this time. The battle would be fought in words, in records, in truths dragged into the light, but the principle remained. No man left behind. As the clerk prepared the next docket, as the gallery held its collective breath, Fair Haven braced for the reckoning that was no longer optional. This wasn't just Jack's fight anymore. Courtroom 4C was never designed for moments like this. The Fairhaven court system expected efficiency, petty thefts, parking violations, maybe the occasional bar fight. What it wasn't prepared for was a decorated Marine colonel, dressed in full-service blues, standing at the witness stand, staring down the entire room like it was his final mission brief. "Please state your name and position for the record," Judge Parker prompted, though his tone carried none of the rote detachment it had before. "Colonel Richard Dunham, United States Marine Corps. Retired." The man answered crisply. His posture was ramrod straight, his ribbons gleaming under the overhead lights. There was no courtroom theater here, no grandstanding, just the weight of a man who'd carried his share of bodies off battlefields, seated behind Jack. The gallery of veterans sat still, silent, but visibly braced. They knew what was coming. Anna Monroe approached the witness stand with the steady, deliberate steps of someone who knew every word would count. "Colonel Dunham, can you tell the court how you know Staff Sergeant Jack Hayes directly?" "Ma'am, he served under my command during our deployment in Fallujah. 3 tours. Hayes was one of my squad leaders, and in your professional assessment. How would you describe his service?" Dunham's jaw tightened slightly. Exemplary. Brave to the point of reckless. He saved lives, mine included. Multiple citations for valor. Never once shirked his duty. A soft murmur rolled through the courtroom. Even Ethan Cole, the prosecutor, seemed to shrink slightly in his seat. Anna didn't rush. "Colonel, are you aware of Mr. Hayes's current legal predicament? I am. Would you consider his alleged crime, stealing an apple and a bread roll, consistent with his character during service?" Dunham didn't hesitate. Absolutely not. Jack Hayes risked his life to ensure others didn't go without. He wouldn't steal unless he had nothing left to lose. The statement hit hard. Anna nodded, flipping to the next page in her folder. "Colonel, you've reviewed Mr. Hayes's VA file termination." "I have. Can you summarize for the court how and why those benefits were cut off?" Dunham inhaled slowly, controlling the anger that was barely beneath the surface, in 2007 following the death of his wife. Mr. Hayes no longer had a fixed mailing address. The VA's system marked his file as no known address. Based on that, his benefits were classified as unserviceable and were terminated. No further outreach was conducted. A rustle went through the gallery. Disbelief, disgust, recognition. "Just to clarify for the record," Anna pressed, "his benefits, his income, his health care, his housing assistance were cut off because the VA couldn't find an address to send paperwork that is correct." Judge Parker's fingers drummed once against the bench, then stopped. Anna's voice dropped lower. Intentional. Intimate. "Colonel, in your view, was this simply a clerical error?" "A minor oversight." Dunham's response was slow. "Deliberate? No, ma'am, this was not a mistake. This was a system designed to forget, designed to let men like Jack slip through cracks that were never meant to be filled. It's not negligence, it's policy through apathy." He looked directly at the bench. "This is not a paperwork error. This is a betrayal of honor." The words dropped like a hammer. The hook was no longer hypothetical. Ethan Cole shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent. The file in front of him was irrelevant now. The court had moved past charges. They were reckoning with conscience. Anna gave Dunham a moment. then continued. In your experience, how common is this kind of systemic neglect for veterans like Mr. Hayes? Dunham's eyes narrowed. All too common. We train them. We use them. We hang medals on their chests. But once they fall out of step, once they're no longer photogenic recruitment material, we make them disappear. He looked toward Jack, then to the room. The only reason Mr. Hayes' story is being heard today is because that dog tag fell on your bench. But there are thousands more. Quiet, unseen, slipping into shadows because no one bothers to ask. Judge Parker sat back slightly, absorbing every word. His hands folded, but his fingers remained tense. Anna closed her folder softly. Thank you, Colonel. She returned to the defense table. For a moment, no one spoke. The courtroom held its breath. Suspended in a silence thick with accountability, Ethan Cole remained seated. His earlier arguments reduced to footnotes. He knew it. Everyone knew it. Judge Parker cleared his throat, eyes moving slowly from the witness stand to Jack Hayes, and then across the sea of veterans behind him. This court recognizes that what we are addressing today extends far beyond the initial charge presented. It touches upon the very foundation of our obligations as a society. The gavel remained untouched, because now, the next strike would mean something far heavier than it ever had before. The room waited for the decision that was no longer about a theft, but about whether Fair Haven, and by extension, the country would acknowledge the quiet debts it owed. No one spoke. No one moved. And in that breathless moment, the truth sat heavier than any verdict yet to come. The weight of the silence in courtroom 4C was suffocating. For a place so used to noise gavel strikes, lawyer objections, murmuring crowds, this stillness felt louder than any verdict. At the defendant's table, Jack Hayes sat unmoving. His hands, rough and scarred, rested on his knees. He didn't look left or right. He simply waited at the bench. Judge William Parker adjusted his glasses. Slowly, methodically. But there was no masking the strain in his jaw or the tension in his fingers. He cleared his throat. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was going to be right. Before this court passes judgment, he began, I believe certain truths need to be spoken plainly. His gaze swept the room. No theatrics, just the quiet weight of accountability. This case was brought forth as a matter of petty theft. An apple? A bread roll? He let the words hang there. But it has revealed something far greater than a minor infraction. It has revealed how easily we, as institutions and as individuals, allow ourselves to forget. The veterans in the gallery sat rigid, silent, watching. Ethan Cole, seated at the prosecutor's table, kept his head down, the arrogance of earlier arguments now replaced with a dawning discomfort. Jack Hayes did not fail this community. Parker continued. This community failed Jack Hayes. The very systems meant to support him chose efficiency over humanity, bureaucracy over duty. He paused, hands resting flat on the bench. Today, we are not here to punish a man for stealing a meal. We are here to correct a debt of honor. The words struck harder than any gavel could. Turning to the defense table, Parker's voice softened, but the conviction remained. Mr. Hayes, this court owes you more than an apology, but it will start with one, on behalf of this institution, and as a man who once owed you his life. I am deeply sorry. He straightened, clearing his throat, effective immediately. All charges against Staff Sergeant Jack Hayes are dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, this court formally recommends the expedited reinstatement of all veterans' benefits owed to him, with retroactive compensation. The courtroom exhaled as one, behind Jack. The veterans sat straighter. Some nodded, some clenched fists silently. Anna Monroe, seated beside Jack, allowed herself the smallest, proudest of smiles. But it wasn't over yet. Judge Parker turned his gaze to Ethan Cole. Mr. Cole, would you like to address the court? Ethan stood slowly. His earlier confidence had been eroded. Layer by layer. He was not a bad man, just a young one who had never been taught to look past the paperwork. He faced Jack directly. Mr. Hayes, Ethan began, voice lower than before. When this case landed on my desk, I saw a name, a charge, and a file. I saw another routine prosecution. What I failed to see was the man behind it. He swallowed hard, forcing the words past his own discomfort. You deserved better from me, from this court, from all of us. I am sorry. There was no performance in his tone, no rehearsed contrition, just the uncomfortable honesty of a man forced to confront his own blind spots. Jack inclined his head slightly. Not a forgiveness, but an acknowledgement. Parker nodded once. The moment was not about humiliation. It was about recognition. With that, the judge reached for his gavel. He held it for a beat longer than usual. Knowing this strike would mean more than just closing a case, this court stands adjourned. The gavel fell. A sound that was, for once, not an end but a correction. As the courtroom stirred, the atmosphere had changed. This was no longer a room of strangers. For a few brief minutes, Fair Haven had remembered itself. Anna placed a firm hand on Jack's shoulder. It's over, Sergeant. At least in here. Jack exhaled slowly, as if releasing a breath he had been holding for years. But before he could stand, the bailiff approached, leaning in quietly. Mr. Hayes, he said, voice lower, with a hint of a smile. You might want to brace yourself. You've got some people waiting outside. Jack frowned, confused. He wasn't prepared for parades. He wasn't interested in speeches. But this wasn't about preparation anymore, as he gathered his duffel bag, heavier now with the weight of restored dignity. The murmur beyond the courtroom doors grew louder. Different from before. Not the rustling of paperwork or idle curiosity. This was anticipation. The moment the doors opened, Jack would be met by something larger than this room had contained, because beyond that threshold, something unexpected awaited him, a reunion he never thought possible. And this time, it wasn't the system calling him forward. It was family. The doors to courtroom 4C swung open, releasing Jack Hayes into a wall of sound. The cold air hit him first, but the voices followed instantly, reporters shouting his name, camera shutters clicking in rapid fire, the hum of live broadcasts bleeding into every corner of the courthouse lobby. Jack squinted against the glare of phone screens and news cameras. For a moment, it was disorienting. The man who had lived invisible for so long was now the center of attention, not by his own choosing, but by the sheer momentum of truth finally breaking free. Anna Monroe stayed close beside him, gently guiding him forward through the chaotic blur. The bailiff's hand hovered near his shoulder, not restraining this time, but guarding. Then the crowd parted. She came through like a breaking wave, a young woman, early 20s, face flushed with emotion, eyes glassy but sharp. Her steps were hesitant at first, but recognition bulldozed hesitation. She moved faster, pushing through bodies, ignoring the cameras, the microphones, the noise. "Uncle Jack," she said. Her voice cracking under the weight of years. Jack froze. Of all the ambushes he had prepared for in life, this was not one of them. Ellie. The name left his lips in a rasp, foreign from disuse but still familiar in the marrow of his bones. In the next heartbeat. She was there, arms flung around him, clutching with the desperate strength of someone afraid he might vanish again, for a moment. Jack stood rigid, his hands hovered, uncertain. Before they found her back, the embrace was tentative at first, then fierce, as memory overtook disbelief. "I found you," Ellie whispered, voice breaking. "We've been looking for you since Aunt Emily passed. You just disappeared." Jack's throat constricted. He pulled back slightly to study her face. The resemblance was undeniable. Emily's laugh lines echoed in the corners of Ellie's mouth. The same defiant spark glinted in her eyes. "I thought there was nothing left," he admitted. The words raw, stripped bare. Ellie shook her head. Fiercely, as if to banish the very idea. "You're not alone, not anymore, around them." The crowd had stilled, the scene unfolding too human, too intimate, to be interrupted. Even the cameras, voracious a moment ago, seemed to lower slightly, respectful in rare unity. Anna stepped back, giving them space, her role momentarily complete. This was not a legal victory. This was a human one. Ellie's grip loosened, but her hands remained on his arms, grounding them both. "After Emily," Jack started. Faltered. "I didn't know how to stay. The house felt like a grave. It was easier to disappear." Ellie's response was immediate. "But disappearing doesn't erase who you are. Or who we are." Her words weren't rehearsed. They were built from years of absence, of unanswered questions, of a family frayed but never severed. Behind them, the doors of the courtroom creaked again. Veterans filtered out quietly, many pausing to nod in Jack's direction, not out of ceremony, but out of acknowledgement. A silent reinforcement of Ellie's words. Anna rejoined them, voice gentle. "The court's done its part, but there's more ahead." "Sergeant?" Jack managed a ghost of a smile. "There always is." Ellie linked her arm through his, no longer tentative. "We'll face it together." For a man who had spent years navigating sidewalks alone. The simple act of having someone walk beside him felt heavier than any medal. As they moved toward the courthouse exit, the crowd adjusted, not blocking, but flanking, observing with a different gaze now. The man they had labeled as homeless, as thief, had been reshaped in their view, not by a press release, but by truth, dragged into the light, outside, the cold bit sharper. But the noise of Fair Haven felt less intrusive. The steps of the courthouse had become a stage, and Jack, despite himself, stood at its center. Ellie squeezed his arm. "Uncle Jack! Do you see what's happening?" He followed her gaze. Phones were still raised. Yes. But the comments scrolling across their screens weren't mocking. They were messages of support, offers of help, stories of other forgotten veterans. Donations for his case had already surpassed what he could have imagined. One apple, one bread roll, and yet, somehow, that small act of survival had cracked open a national conversation. "You thought your story ended in that grocery store," Ellie said, voice firm. But it didn't. It just reached the right ears. Jack exhaled, the breath forming a cloud in the crisp air. "Not the story I wanted to tell." "Maybe." Ellie smiled softly. "But maybe it's the story people needed to hear." At the bottom of the courthouse steps, Anna's phone buzzed relentlessly. Interview requests, statements. But she didn't interrupt. This was not the moment for headlines. It was a moment of reclamation. For Jack. For his family. For everyone who had quietly slipped through cracks designed to forget them. The courthouse doors closed behind them with a soft, final thud. But Jack knew the real story wasn't closing. It was only beginning. Because what had started in a forgotten grocery aisle now echoed far beyond Fair Haven. And the country was still listening. What began as a petty theft case in a small Ohio courtroom had become a national reckoning. Jack Hayes' story was no longer confined to Fair Haven. It had exploded across media outlets, hashtags multiplying by the hour, veterans organizations, advocacy groups, and ordinary citizens flooded news feeds with one simple message. This was never just about a stolen apple and a bread roll. It was about what happens when a nation forgets to care. Within 48 hours of Megan Blake's livestream going viral, major networks picked up the narrative. Morning anchors leaned into words like forgotten hero and institutional failure, their polished voices layering emotion over statistics. But the numbers didn't lie. Jack wasn't an isolated oversight. He was the face of a problem everyone had known existed but no one wanted to see, the Veterans Affairs Department. Long criticized for its labyrinthine bureaucracy, found itself under an unforgiving spotlight. Pressure mounted from every direction: public outrage, congressional inquiries, even former VA officials speaking out. The dam broke when the Secretary of Veterans Affairs stepped in front of the cameras. A live press conference, broadcast coast to coast. No spin, no carefully worded deflection, for once. There was only admission. The Department of Veterans Affairs acknowledges the grievous mishandling of Staff Sergeant Jack Hayes' case. His benefits were wrongfully terminated due to procedural neglect and a systemic failure to safeguard those who have served this country. For that, we extend our deepest apologies not only to Mr. Hayes, but to every veteran who has faced similar injustices. It wasn't enough to erase the years Jack had lost, but it was a start. Within the same breath, the VA announced a full reinstatement of Jack's benefits, housing assistance, medical coverage, and, most notably, retroactive compensation dating back to the day his file had been closed. The figure was staggering. Headlines were quick to latch onto it. Veteran wrongly denied $278,000 in back pay restored. Yet, for Jack, the number was irrelevant. No dollar amount could buy back what had been stolen time. Dignity. A place in the world. But this wasn't just about restitution. It was about recognition. What struck deeper than the official apology was the public's response. Messages flooded in from strangers, families of veterans, active duty soldiers, letters, emails, calls, not sympathy, solidarity. Jack Hayes had become a mirror. People weren't seeing just a homeless veteran anymore. They were seeing themselves. The father who returned from war and struggled in silence. The neighbor whose benefits got lost in a bureaucratic shuffle. The community that had once stood for something more than convenience. Ellie, never far from Jack's side, became his unintentional spokesperson. With Anna Monroe managing the legal maze, Ellie handled the human side, reading messages aloud to Jack, filtering through interview requests, gently shielding him when the noise grew too loud. "Uncle Jack, do you realize what you've started?" she asked one evening, scrolling through a message from a Gold Star widow. "You're not just getting your life back, you're forcing this country to remember its promises." Jack, never one for speeches, only nodded. He hadn't asked to be a symbol. He had just wanted to survive. But sometimes, survival was the most powerful statement in Fair Haven. The shift was palpable. The same people who once crossed the street to avoid Jack now nodded in greeting. Marcy's Diner, where the waitresses had quietly fed him in better and worse times, placed a framed photo of him in his marine blues near the register. Beneath a small plaque that read, "He stood for us." We stand with him, the town's mayor, sensing both moral obligation and political reality, announced an unprecedented event, a public ceremony. Not a routine Veterans Day parade, not a symbolic gesture, a celebration of service, of correction, of community reckoning for Jack Hayes, for every name that had slipped between the cracks as the announcement went public. News crews scheduled to cover Jack's human interest story now had a bigger headline. Ellie squeezed Jack's hand when they heard the news. "They're not doing this out of guilt," she said. "They're doing it because it's time." Jack looked out the window of the small apartment now registered in his name. His name. On a lease. After all these years. It felt foreign. "This isn't my victory," he said quietly. "It's just a debt finally called in." Anna Monroe agreed, and Fairhaven's about to make its payment. The courthouse where it all began would be the centerpiece. Streets would be lined with banners. Schools planned to send students to learn not just about Jack, but about what happens when people stop looking away. It was no longer about a trial. It was about acknowledgement as the ceremony approached. The calls from larger networks intensified. National morning shows, veterans advocacy panels, politicians eager to stand beside Jack for the photo opportunity, but Jack remained focused on one thing. This wasn't about him standing on a stage. It was about making sure no one else would have to sit in that defendant's chair for the crime of being forgotten. From one fallen apple. An entire community had been forced to look in the mirror, and they hadn't liked what they saw. But they were ready to do better. As Fairhaven prepared for a day unlike any in its history, the question was no longer whether Jack Hayes would be honored. It was whether the town could hold itself accountable. The nation was still watching, and this time, there would be no looking away. The sun cut through the Ohio chill, spilling golden light across Fairhaven's main square. For once, it wasn't the courthouse casting the longest shadow. It was the crowd, veterans in dress blues, families clutching small flags. Locals who'd once walked past Jack Hayes now stood waiting, shoulder to shoulder. A temporary stage had been erected beneath the old war memorial, but the true monument today was the man standing quietly off to the side. Jack watched, uneasy in his newly issued blazer, the fabric too stiff, the attention too sharp. He'd never fought for ceremonies, but today wasn't for him alone. As the mayor approached the microphone, his voice echoed across the square. Today, Fairhaven doesn't give a man a medal for heroism. Today, we acknowledge the cost of forgetting that heroism in the first place. He gestured toward Jack. Jack Hayes didn't need a medal to be a hero, but we need to remember what he represents. The crowd responded not with applause, but with a solemn standing ovation. Not loud, not performative. Just real. Ellie squeezed Jack's hand. It's your turn. Jack didn't like speeches. He liked straight talk. So when he stepped onto the stage, he didn't search for words. He spoke from the place that had stayed silent too long. I didn't save lives for medals, he said. Didn't fight for thanks. I fought because, where I come from, you don't leave people behind. He scanned the faces. Old Marines, young families, strangers who suddenly looked familiar. But when you come home, Jack continued, you hope maybe someone will come back for you. 2. The hush was complete. Not a cough, not a shuffle, just the weight of what he'd said settling on every chest. He didn't speak long. He didn't need to. Truth doesn't require a speech writer as he stepped down. Ellie caught him, smiling through tears. You didn't think they'd listen. Jack shrugged. Wasn't sure they remembered how. The ceremony closed. But the story didn't. Within days, Jack was handed keys to a small, warm apartment. Not charity, recognition. The lease was in his name. Alongside him trotted Rocky, A service dog donated by a veterans foundation, trained, loyal, and as quietly resilient as his new owner. Jack knelt beside him, scratching behind the ears. Never thought I'd have a house again. Buddy, let alone company. Ellie laughed. From stealing bread to owning a kitchen. That's progress. Yet. There was one place Jack needed to see before this chapter could close. Fairhaven's park hadn't changed much. Same cracked benches, same rusted lampposts, but where once Jack huddled alone. Today he returned differently. He sat on his old bench, but this time, Ellie was beside him. Rocky lay at his feet. Content, nobody should call this home. Jack said quietly. But for a while, it was. Ellie looked around, kids played, neighbors chatted, life continued. But here, at this bench, something had come full circle. Nobody's asking you to forget. Uncle Jack, just to let it belong to the past. Jack didn't reply. He didn't need to. The presence of family, of a place to return to, spoke louder than any words in his pocket. Worn soft from years of handling, was the photograph of Emily as the sun dipped, painting the park in honeyed gold. Jack drew it out, Emily's smile, timeless, untouched by the years that had nearly buried him. Found my way back? Em, he murmured, just like you said I would. Rocky stirred at his feet. Ellie rested her head on his shoulder. The wind, once sharp and biting, now only brushed gently against his face, from a forgotten veteran to a remembered man. Jack's journey had never been about the apple or the bread. It had been about being seen. And now, as Fairhaven finally remembered. So did he, because loss might scatter people, but kindness quiet, steady, relentless has a way of leading them home. Jack Hayes had never asked for fanfare, but what he received was something far more enduring, dignity, restored, and a community learning how to remember. Jack Hayes was a name quietly slipping into oblivion, not because he changed, but because society had grown too comfortable looking away from things that were no longer convenient to remember. An apple? A bread roll? Items too small for anyone to notice. But behind them lay a much larger story, a story of loyalty, of those who once stood for their country, only to be left behind by it. The strange thing is, Jack never asked to be honored. All he wanted was simple, that when a person returns from war, someone would still be waiting for them. Thankfully. That quiet hope was finally answered not just through late apologies, but through the awakening of an entire community. Fairhaven learned how to remember again, starting from the smallest things. But Jack's story isn't just about one veteran. It raises a bigger question for all of us. How many other Jack Hayes are still out there, quietly enduring, simply because we choose not to see them? If this story resonated with you, if you've ever known someone like Jack, share this story. Because sometimes, a single click can be the start of someone's overdue recognition. If you believe kindness and gratitude should never depend on paperwork, hit like and share this video so more people can hear Jack's story. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because here, we'll continue sharing the stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Stories that make you stop and think.